Hi, my name is Steve Collins from Hermosa Cyclery. I'm going to show you how we geofenced our EBC electric bike rental fleet. After some initial prep work and one or two bikes under my belt, it took about 25 minutes per bike to install the full system. So to geofence an e-bike, you need to be able to turn off the motor. Fortunately, e-bikes, almost all of them, have a brake sensor that will do that. When you squeeze the brake lever, it sends a signal down the brake sensor wire to the controller in the frame, and that controller tells the motor to turn off. So if we can tap into that sensor with our tracker, we can have our tracker likewise turn off the motor. So what we'll do is we'll mount a tracker on the bike, run the wire up through the frame and up to the handlebar area. We'll split the sensor wire with a Y-splitter that you'll see in the video, connect one end of it back to the controller, the existing connection, and then we'll connect our special wire that goes to the tracker to the other end of the Y connector. That way, when the bike enters into a space where it's not allowed, the tracker detects that and sends a signal to the e-bike to turn the motor off by essentially activating the brake sensor. What's occurring electronically is that the positive wire of the sensor cable is being connected to the ground wire. When you squeeze the brake lever, that sends a signal to the controller to turn off the motor. Similarly, the tracker has a relay that's activated by the geofence system that grounds the wire, the positive to the negative of the brake sensor, sending the signal to the motor to turn off. Check to make sure your bike is working, then remove the battery on your EBC Model E or Model R. Gently remove the cables. There's usually a little bit of slack. Then detach the alarm. The Trackhawk tracker we are using has a range of 9 to 90 volts. Fortunately, the alarm we're removing has an always-on 12-volt power source that we are able to tap into for our tracker. Here is the 12-volt always-on power source from the alarm system that I mentioned. Remove the battery mount nearest to the crank. Now we'll fish a standard brake cable through the frame. Through this tube and out near where the controller is. And outward toward the back to exit the frame. Connect the yellow relay wire from the harness and pull it back through the frame. Cut the wire at about this length and strip the end of it. Now we have the yellow wire of the harness threaded through the frame to meet with the brake sensor up toward the handlebar. Now let's prep the tracker. Remove the casing and then remove the plastic inside. There are two switches. The yellow one is the battery backup switch that we want to flip on. And that's it for the tracker prep. Put the tracker cover back on and apply some double back tape. Thread this end of the tracker harness up through the frame and to the point where we will mount the tracker. Plug in the tracker and position the wire to its final location and press the tracker into place on the frame. Plug the tracker's power cable into the power supply that we removed from the alarm. Now we'll reinsert all the cables back into the frame, starting with the tracker's harness and wires. Essentially, the cables just fold up inside the frame. Now we'll reinstall the battery mount. We're doing that last so that we can leave room inside the frame compartment. Here you see the controller, which hangs loose, which is typical of most e-bikes, Having it hang loose allows us to insert the cables more easily back into the frame. The cables on the back of the battery mount are somewhat twisted from the factory, so they'll fit more easily beside the controller. Add some of the removable type Loctite to the screws so they won't jiggle loose. Now we will add the Gillette brake sensor plug to our yellow wire. We use these solder seal wire connectors to connect the two. The yellow wire threads into the solder element, and then you squeeze it with the pliers so the wires will stay put. Then use a heat gun to melt the solder. Don't point it at the bike like I'm doing. This is for demonstration. These little things are great. We will use this Gillette splitter to connect our yellow wire to the brake sensor of the e-bike. The e-bike brake lever has two lines running from it. One is the brake line, and the other is the brake sensor wire, typically the thinner one seen here. You can also identify it from its plug. This is usually about where on the bike you'll find the split point of the brake sensor wire, which you will separate and insert this splitter. We're splitting the wire from the brake handle and replugging it back into the brake sensor as original, and the other end is going to go to our yellow wire that we brought through the frame. Here's the yellow wire that we just soldered together that we will connect this plug to. First, we want to thread it down through the frame tube and out the other end. Insert the extra yellow wire and cable back into the frame and reinstall the boot that keeps them in place. Now let's go ahead and plug the brake sensor splitter into our yellow wire Gillette plug that we installed earlier. Now is a good time to get the cables organized again. There's a lot of cables coming from an e-bike, and if you wrap them too tightly, they can become unplugged from turning the handlebars. So always make sure there's enough slack and that they're not dangling too loose. And lastly, reinstall the battery. Here is the wire diagram for the bike we just installed the tracker on. Notice that the power supply comes from the controller directly into the tracker, and then from the tracker the yellow wire goes to the brake sensor using the splitter. Here's a wiring diagram that would work on any bike that doesn't have power coming out of the controller like we did going to our alarm system. Essentially, you split the battery wires. The splitter you see in this diagram is readily available. As you can probably tell, I did some prep work on the wires. We were installing these on a fleet of 18 bikes, so it made sense to prep items in advance. E-bike plugs tend to be off-the-shelf plugs. This one is for our power connector that we were able to attach to the alarm system. I shortened and stripped the wires, then soldered them with the solder connectors to the harness wires, black to black and red to red, just as would be intuitive. After squeezing the solder together with pliers to hold the wires in place, you use a heat gun to melt the solder and the plastic resin on each side that bonds to the housing. Wrap one wire individually with electrical tape, then wrap the wires together with electrical tape to keep them together and insulated. This is the Gillette plug that you saw being connected to the yellow wire near the handlebars. I cut off the black wire and stripped and used the red wire. For these types of wires, typically the blue or red is the positive wire that you want to connect to. At the end of each, I added a solder wire connector. You can see the Gillette splitters in the upper section of this image. Those came ready to go. The rest of the items I prepped as I just showed you, and it really wasn't that much work. It went pretty fast. With the wires prepped and ready to go, installation time dropped down to 22 minutes per bike. The first one took probably about an hour and a half. But like anything else, after a few of them, you drop down the learning curve pretty rapidly and it goes quick. This is the TrackHawk brand tracker that I use to geofence our fleet. I can't recommend them highly enough. The platform is intuitive and the device works really well, essentially plug and play. This is the geofencing platform. Right here is the geofence that we drew around the Strand and the Plaza, and there's bike 5, which is the only bike we have in the system. Notifications where you do most of your geofence settings. Notice up above we have bike inside geofence. This is where we shut the motor off if it's inside geofence. Just below we have bike outside of geofence, and this is where we would turn the motor back on. Click here to set the parameters. Here you see bike 5, which is our only bike. We have it set to geofence. You can also set it for speed, so if someone's going too fast, among other settings. These are more settings for the area. Here's where I can get notified. So if the bike goes in or out of the geofence, I can be notified. And down below is the command that's sent to tell the motor to turn off. It's called enable kill switch. So as soon as the bike enters the geofence zone, this command is sent and the motor is turned off. These are just more settings. This is for messaging and some final details. The geofence is pretty easy to set up. It's pretty intuitive. Here's the one we drew. You just click on this tool here. You can see there's all kinds of colors you can set for the geofenced areas. To edit, you would just click on the geofence you began or begin a new one, and you can stretch things around. Double click to create another pivot point. And when you're done editing, you can just hit save and your new geofence will fill that space you just created. It's pretty easy. More messaging features can be found in here, more settings, and here is where you see our single bike. If we had 20 bikes, they'd all be in this list and all behave the same way. Our friends to the north in Manhattan Beach have a strand that is for walking only. As a courtesy, our fleet can be geofenced similarly so that the motor would turn off if they tried to ride their e-bike on their walk-only strand. This, of course, could be done for any city from Santa Monica to Palos Verdes or anywhere in the world for that matter.